Everyone, thank you for coming to this Spotlight event that has been hosted by the National Marine Science Committee. I think we have a fair bit of people from different areas, not directly related to the National Marine Committee, so it's great to see you here. For the ones who don't know me, I'm Kim Pika, and I'm the Vice Chair of the committee, and as well as I'm a geoscientist at Geoscience Australia. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and sea country in Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They were the first scientist, explorer, and resource expert and environmental manager, and their custodianship set the benchmark for true sustainability. So today's focus is on the value of marine industry and our sciences to the Australian economy. We've all heard over the past years that the contribution of the blue economy is projected to be worth 100 billion per annum by 2025. And at present, it's already estimated at 70 billion. Thanks to AIMS for having tracked this over the past 15 or so years, and we'll hear more about this soon. This value is quite impressive for all of us, and considering that science enables and contributes to this bottom line, understanding the contribution of our science to that is important. So the agenda for today is we have 3 speakers that are going to take us through different angles here. We have Dr. Llewellyn, who's a research manager at AIMS and has the responsibility for improving science impact. He'll present on the AIMS Marine Index 2020 and the science impact of his organization of AIMS. We have Dr. Brendan Brooke, who's the director of the National Seabed Mapping Section at Geoscience Australia, and he'll present on the value of Australian seabed mapping to our economy. And finally, Dr. Tara Martin is the acting facilities program director of the Marine National Facility, and she'll present on the impact of the facility. And then we'll have time for a discussion. There'll be discussion after each of the presentation. If you have questions, please put them in the chat during the presentation. Otherwise, raise your hand at the end and then open the mics. If you can keep your video turned off during the presentation, we might save bandwidth and make sure things go well. So I thought, because again, there's many of you who may not be familiar with the National Marine Science Committee, I thought I'd just give a really quick overview about the committee itself. It's an advisory body that's focused on promoting the nexus between high quality marine science and the growth of the Australia's blues economy. It's a mechanism for coordination and information sharing between research institutions, universities, government departments, state, territory governments, and the broader Australian marine science community. The committee is the means by which a lot of interdisciplinary and geographically dispersed community comes together to provide robust, scientifically robust and user-relevant advice on marine issues. The committee was first known as the Ocean Policy Science Advisory Group and was established in '98. So one of the big output of the committee is the National Marine Science Plan that was published in 2015 as a decadal plan focused on investment on the biggest development and sustainability challenges facing Australia's marine estate. And that's a product of extensive consultation with Australian marine science community, government, and the industry. So with this being said, just very soon you'll see the launch of our midway review. We've looked at the plan and looked at the progress that we've made against the recommendation that were in the plan, and look at what has changed and happened since 2015 and what do we need to focus on going forward to make sure that we have a healthy ocean, a vibrant society, and a strong economy. So that was a bit of the PR for the committee here, for all the newcomers, and welcome again. I will stop sharing my screen here and let Lyndon present on the AIMS Marine Index and the AIMS Impact story. Well, yours, Lyndon, if you can share.
Coming through okay?
Yes, you need to swap again. screen.
Hang on, it's come on a different screen. Sorry. What's happened here? Now, let me go to the other screen.
We did the trial before it worked.
Yeah, the trial worked perfectly, didn't it? So. Sorry about this. How about now?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
There we go.
Audience.
All right. Great. Thanks very much, Kim. And like yourself, I'll acknowledge the traditional owners of where I work. Ames Council's on the lands of the Wulguru Kabar and Bindal people. And I take it one step further. I actually live in the suburb of Wulguru, named after Wulguru Kabar people. And like yourself, I acknowledge their long history of observing and science that they've done within Australia. I'm going to talk today about two topics. One is, as Kim said, about the Ames Marine Index, which is now being published, and it's on our website if you want to go through the detail of it. And then also talk about a recent study done on ourselves about the impact of our science. And I'll probably touch on a few topics that are of interest to a few people as we've learnt from this exercise. Kim also asked, give a bit of an introduction about why we do these sorts of things, or why would the community do these sorts of things, and how you go about doing that. And I'll quickly go through this first slide, which comes from a colleague of mine at a small boutique economics firm called the Centre for International Economics, who conducted the analysis of ourselves. And I found it actually a really useful way of thinking about things. Sometimes it seemed to be a bit of a tension between economic and environmental good, that the two can't coexist. But if you think about it through the lens of what they call the Pareto efficiency, if you look at the horizontal axis, which is about economic return and the quantity of it, and if you then look at the top half of the vertical axis, which is about the price of the good that's being developed for that economic return, you can see that as the demand for it goes, the price goes down. That's the classic thing, we produce more of it. And of course, science can play a role there, because it can produce more economic good by reducing the price of producing that economic good. So not just about products, but how people go about doing business. There's a whole raft of things that can be done there. But if you look at the bottom axis, that's also about the environmental good. And so you do get this tension between how much economic good versus environmental good. And of course, the two things do interact with each other. And the science can actually enable more environmental good to be done for in a world where more economic activity is happening. So it goes a bit towards the heart of the sustainable growth part to it. And so you can see that science has a role to play, both in economic return and environmental return, in changing the frontiers at which they can operate and the amount of return they can give to society. It also helps to be able to compare and contrast, and to be able to integrate those sorts of values to actually operate in a common currency. So that's why you get all the concepts of ecosystem services and nature's contribution to peoples and things like that, which convert environmental returns into dollar values, because that's the obvious currency that economic return is done in. So that's where you do get these total economic values. They look at both the market return and non-market return, and they try and put it into a single common currency, so you can add it all together, or you can compare and contrast and work out, well, what sort of trade-off decisions you might need to make about whether you put effort into one area versus the other. So I'll quickly go through the index. Like I said, it's on our website. You can download and go through it in detail. It has been going for some time now. We've got quite a few have been done. This most recent one, while it's called the Index 2020, there's an important point here. There's actually a 1 to 2 year lag in the data that gets produced that you can work on with these sorts of things. It takes some time for the data to be gathered quality checked, and then produced in a form that can be consumed by users. And so while it's Index 2020, it's actually looking at what the blue economy or the marine industry was at in 2017-18. So it's got a 2-year lag to it. The other thing we did this differently this last time around was try to break it down into different states and try to get some idea of how different states operate, or what the industry was like in different states. And also part of the continuous improvement was some sort of better analysis of the tourism data. So the headline figures are there. It's basically, it's well over $80 billion. It's dominated by offshore natural gas, followed by tourism, and then oil and the maritime sector. Many hundreds of thousands of jobs maintained by the marine and maritime industries. And the important point about this is when you put it in relativity, it's larger than the coal sector, it's larger than heavy and civil engineering, it's larger than agriculture when you look at all those numbers together. So it's quite substantial. It draws upon bits and pieces of those other sectors, but as a sector, it is quite substantial, and it is continuing to grow. This is how things have changed over time. The improved methodology for tourism was pushed back to 2013-14. So you'll see a change in the graph there, where that's actually driven a fair bit by a change in that methodology. But importantly, you see there's a dip in 2015-16. That's driven by the market price for oil and gas. And so that actually causes a dip in that particular period of time. And you'll see in the table that the appearance of water transport. This is part of what happens as well, is that data sources come on stream and you can start looking at them and you can start bringing them in and you can be confident about them. So this has started to appear. We've been able to get data going back a few years, so it's added on top of that. And that's where the $81 billion comes from, is the summation of all those different sectors. Just to give you some idea of the state-based distribution, and some of this won't be a surprise to people, I think intuitively we know that there'll be biases towards different sectors in different locations. But this particular graph also gives you a bit of a clue as to some of the data challenges in this particular space. So if you look at Australia, you look at marine tourism. The marine tourism is done by, it's based upon the Australian Bureau of Science, the ABS data, but they draw their data from Tourism Research Australia. And their data that TRA produces is from a model. And that model is then integrated, or what the method is now, is that it's then integrated with visitor surveys. So we can actually identify the activities that people do when they go on various activities. Now, some of that data you can see, if you look at, when you break it down to state levels, you'll find that the numbers would indicate that there's no international tourism in some states. And that's a part of, or that's a factor of, the resolution and granularity of the data sources at this level. I also think that, having had a close look at how this was done, and much of this work is done by Deloitte's Asset Economics, is I think that Tourism Research Australia's numbers underestimate the dollar value of international tourism, especially as how we think about it in terms of the blue economy. So while we're looking at $10 billion, $9 billion, $5 billion for domestic tourism in the big eastern states, and some substantial numbers for the international tourism, I think those international tourism numbers are an underestimate, and I think the numbers are in fact larger than what we have found. So I've started to get into the habit of saying that I think these numbers are at least as what we are finding. So the numbers in the index are at least many tens of billions of dollars in tourism, and at least $81 billion, because I think there are some parts of it that are underestimated. Offshore oil and gas, there's really only 3 states that have that there. West Australia is the biggie. Victoria's got a substantial field in Bass Strait. The activity of Victoria is very mature. Some of it's reaching end of life, leading to some of the issues that are being thought about nationally about decommissioning. But of course, in Western Australia, it is relatively new compared to other oil and gas fields, and it will be productive for many years to come. This was done in 2017-18, so the Northern Territory contribution is relatively low at the moment. I suspect when we look at them 2018-19, it'll be much higher than that. But then, of course, it'll hit COVID, and we'll see some changes in the 2020-21 years. The maritime sector, and this is an amalgamation of a number of different sectors, so building boats, boat sales, infrastructure, marine development, all those sorts of things. And you'll find it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's spread somewhat evenly, more evenly around the country than the other sectors. Queensland, West Australia, South Australia, very coastal states, lots of activities, high recreational fishing, the beach life is very important to people. So there's a lot of small boats and a lot of other activities there. And of course, a lot of marinas, maritime traffic, ports traffic in those particular states as well. So a substantial part of the economy probably adds up to about $8 to $10 billion worth of the marine industry index. Seafood, and this is a combination of commercial, recreational aquaculture. Tasmania is the largest one, according to the data that we have. Much of that is aquaculture. And then you have some substantial commercial fisheries in places like West Australia and Queensland and Victoria. So it's not as big as oil and gas and tourism, but it's still several $1 billion worth of the Australian economy comes from seafood, both cultured and wild caught, whether it's recreational or whether it's commercial. So the important steps, well, the things we're doing now with that index, because we recognise it still has some improvements to be made, is it's only as good as the underlying data. So one of the things that we're looking at is continually improving data sources. So we're looking at that. That's what happened with the tourism. And I think the next time around, we'll probably have another closer look to the tourism for the next index. It also brings in as yet untracked sectors. So there are other sectors that are emerging that we've not yet found data sources for. But I suspect that we can, if we look harder and look in other places, we will find them. So I'd expect that we'll start seeing some other sectors contributing to the index that we haven't done now, haven't got till now. We also kicked off an exercise to start looking at how we can look at non-market benefits. There's been a number of studies like that, obviously in the Great Barrier Reef, looking at the non-market benefits. The Great Southern Reef, there are other exercises looking at the ecosystem service returns that are not converted into market returns. So we're looking at how we might do that at a national scale. And of course, 2022 will actually capture the COVID-19 effects. So at the moment, I think there's a fair bit of speculation about what the numbers will show. I think there'll probably be some predictable effects there with oil and gas and tourism, obvious ones, but I think we might be surprised by a couple of other ones. So it will be interesting to see what we get next time we look at that. All right, so looking at the value of AIM science. So we did this analysis. So what we're doing as an organisation is basically trying to mature ourselves, evolve ourselves from being mission-driven, focusing on outcomes, to being mission-driven for societal impact. And the bottom figure is a pretty traditional figure that you'll see, which is the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts framework. And part of the reason for doing that is that it actually gives us a way of having the conversation with our stakeholders about the value of science. And that's really important also for ourselves, because it's a good morale boost to actually know you're doing something worthwhile. And we're looking at ways and we are improving how we actually build that into our processes and how we plan our science. So we're actually planning for impact. And we've given ourselves some specific targets in our strategy, one of which is producing at least $100 million per annum in environmental, social, and economic net benefits. And in terms of communication, often this has been a difficult one to get across to people as to what is impact. And it means different things to different people. And often impact is spoken about in terms of, well, someone changed their policy based on my science. And that's actually an outcome. And I phrase it sometimes as being stakeholder impact, so that the scientists will actually be aware they've actually had some impact. But until that policy change leads to some sort of material benefit and an improvement in the world around us, then it hasn't had that societal impact. It hasn't had that economic or environmental return. And that's what we're shooting for, is actually have that material change in the world around us. It becomes a better place. So our role is to try and push beyond the outcomes and actually have those societal impacts and those societal benefits returning, which obviously gets far out of it. It's much more out of our control. But that doesn't mean we can't aim for it. It doesn't mean we can't try and influence it. And that goes very much towards the the planning part of our science. So part of the story is doing that is coming together with some real world impact stories. So very much impact stuff is actually a lot of storytelling, looking at how we do things and how our science has led to improved ports and dredging guidelines. Whoops, lost a couple of animations there, but doesn't matter. So there are things about biodiversity effects and things like that. How do you go? But now we actually want to turn that from storytelling into a dollar figure. Impact, while complex, is actually really a simple concept. It's really just understanding the change from the expected or change from where the trajectory was going versus attribution or times attribution. So if you look at the system state, where are we heading? That's the orange line. But if we do some science, potentially we'll produce that blue line. And the impact is the difference between those two lines. And attribution is a really difficult thing to do. Science is very crowded, lots of scientists, lots of organizations. It's a combination of lots of users. Not all users have the same impact upon the thing that you want to change at the end. And then you actually want to produce a better world. Is it a better world or not? Have you actually produced a material improvement? And all of that takes time. And the attribution, I'll come back to the attribution a bit later on. And of course, when you're looking at impact, the other side of it too is that if a system state is deteriorating, if you can actually reverse that or even reduce the level of deterioration, then the difference between those two changes is also impact. So it's not just about making things better on a positive trajectory, but slowing down a negative trajectory. So one of the case studies we did was looking at the Great Barrier Reef and looking at reef science and how do you value a market benefit from environmental science. This is a really difficult thing to do. And where we kind of landed was finding a data series or data set that comes from the ABS where they looked at resource rent. Some of you may recall a debate some time ago in Australia now about the resource rent tax. And resource rent is a really simple concept in principle, which is this is a resource, this is how much money is spent to access it, this is how much money you made from it, and this is your profit. Simple as that. But with environmental policies, and when you make changes and improvements, often you'll see activities will decline. And this is what happened when they did the rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef. When they rezoned in 2004, they made some really significant changes where they actually bought out licenses and they bought out boats, they bought out fishermen, because there was deep concerns that the fishing was becoming unsustainable. And you can see that in the numbers. If you look at the number of fishing licenses, you can see how much they dropped down. You look at the fishing effort in terms of thousands of days, again, it drops down. But when the ABS actually looked at their numbers, they found that this resource rent actually went up. And then when you actually did, they then calculated that for a number of sectors. They looked at tourism, recreation, fisheries and aquaculture. We're able to actually pull out some non-use and non-market values as well. And what that does is then gives you a cumulative amount of resource rent over time. Now, what's the reference case? Well, it's really hard in a really big, complex state to actually say what the reference case is. And of course, it changes from day to day, week to week, month to month. So we have to make some assumptions there. But of course, as we all know, if you look at the Great Barrier Reef, it has not stayed the same for the last 15, 20 years. If you then look at, if there's a 2% decline, this is what you get. And of course, then the benefits are higher. And if you've got in the worst case, which you looked at, which is a 5% decline, it's obviously the returns are better, but the reality is a 5% decline would actually mean that the GBR does not exist anymore. So, my next graph didn't show this. So the next one, what we did was we then projected that forward to 2020, and we used a 10% reference case and looked at the difference. And the difference between those two things then gave us a dollar value for what had improved on the GBR in terms of resource rent returns. But then the question then becomes, how much did science contribute to that? The government now collects, and I don't know how publicly it's made, but collects data about how much money is spent upon science relative to the GBR and how much is spent upon evidence-based management of the GBR. And if you look at those numbers, you can actually see that the total amount is the red number. It's up to about $350 to $400 million. And a proportion of that is aims. And we can actually calculate that from the numbers that are published. So we were able to calculate we then did a similar calculation for oil and gas, and we then, we can actually factor in a couple of other things, and we come up with the value of our science having produced in the last year. We can look at over $300 million. And it's probably going to be more than that because that's not our whole portfolio. But for us, we need to actually understand that market-driven impacts are also subject to market forces. We actually need to have better reference curves, and we need more sophisticated attribution. In that process, the Centre for International Economics have done a number of studies around the country on a number of things, and have done some whole of economy models about the contribution of advanced biological sciences to different industry sectors. So they then took that model and applied it to our marine index, and then started to try and work out what marine science as a whole contributed to the marine industry index. And you can see their calculation was somewhere between 1.6 and $3 billion coming from marine science. And if you, depending on what the figure is, in terms of how much is spent on marine science in Australia, you can work out a multiplier. And that brings those two studies together, the index and our study as well. So I just sort of finish off with a couple of ideas for what I think are challenges that the community should consider. One is consistency. So when you look at market numbers, we actually need to have there needs to be better national accountants that can allow us to draw out this number, and probably need to involve the Australian Bureau of Statistics in that sort of conversation. There is an internationally recognised system for environmental economic accounting. And UNEP is actually, and Australia is a signatory to this particular process that comes out of UNEP. And there are a number of projects that are doing that already. I think, projects happening in DOR, and that I think that's something that needs to be promulgated through the whole community, so we're all talking the same language and doing things a similar way. I think as a community, we need to actually better understand attribution, because then once you understand attribution, then it can actually proactively maximise the impact, and we can promote the science value to stakeholders. And that's might be mercenary and political, but the reality is we've always got to try and get across to people just how important marine science is. And also the key thing is the two things that I spoke about there, about looking backwards. We actually need to look forwards. We actually need to start thinking about how we can predict future states, and then demonstrate and prove that the science has prevented some of those future states coming about, or that the future state that does come about is better than it could have been if the science hadn't happened. And so I think, Kim, that might be my last one, and I'll wrap it up there. I'll stop.
Thank you, Lyndon. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks, everyone. We've got time if you want. I might not be able to see everyone if you have a hand. Oh, I see Jazz. Oh, Jazz clapping. If you have a question, anyone, maybe open your mic. Oh, yeah, wait.
Yes, Kim, and also Lyndon, that was a very good report. So my question there, while I was proposed in the past, I guess, and can we, you did talk about the including the and yet and accounted sector. So what about in your sort of marine, blue economy or bioeconomy? In terms currently you have the food, you have the agriculture, you have fisheries, and are you intended or plan to include the marine bioproducts sector?
That is one of the untracked sectors, and I think that's a really important one. I think that's we need to be able to try and find a data source that we can reliably pull into it. So that is one I think that we should put some effort into. So the next index will actually have some marine bioproducts and dollar figures in there.
Because given that NBCRs are founded another way, if you look at the other countries, particularly the European Union, they have done many years. And there's some sort of model we can follow. So would it be not so difficult for Australia, but it's quite important for us into the next generation of the industry.
I completely agree. I think it's one of the weaknesses of the index is it doesn't have. We struggle with the emerging sectors, and I think that's a story we need to focus on and bring them up and actually start talking about them, because the reality is if we want to try and reduce climate change, then a very big part of the blue end of the marine industry index will disappear. And so we have a responsibility to think about how do you replace it. We can't just say stop doing something without actually trying to give solutions. That's my view anyway. So while we can be proud about its growth and size, the reality is that with time it will disappear. So we need to actually start thinking about the replacement.
Yes, I guess this become very important in terms of our future regenerative, blue bioeconomy or bioeconomy. And large oil and gas and mineral, of course, will go in some years, right? Yeah.
Yep.
This is where I think your report is important to point out.
Completely agree.
Have an impact on our society. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Wade. Sounds like, Lyndon, you've got someone to go and talk to add an emergent industry to your index 2022. Any other question? You can turn on your video too. That makes you come forward quickly. That's wonderful. I think we'll just keep going. We'll have another, think about your question, and we'll have another session of question at the end of the 3 speakers. So Brendan, you want to share your screen?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Hopefully I'll get this right.
Just need to go in the presenter view, or full presentation mode.
How's that?
I think it's just lagging behind, but I saw you tried to press the button. You've got to swap again, display settings, swap your screen. Thank you.
What about now?
Yeah, all yours.
Okay, thanks, Kim. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk today. It's great, and yeah, I really enjoyed that stimulating talk from Lyndon. So what I'm talking about today is some initial results from a report that's still not released. So it's somewhat still sort of underway, but very soon will be. And it's all about the value of seabed mapping data to the blue economy. This was a report or a study that's been undertaken by Deloitte's Access Economics. I guess it's sort of being led by us in terms of the Geoscience Australia, in terms of the commissioning of it, but with some financial support through and help through the Australian Hydrographic Office, and in particular, the steering committee of AusSeaBed has really helped in assisting Deloitte getting the information that they need to undertake this work. Okay. Right, so drivers, why did we do the report? So we were after a national perspective on seabed mapping data production, and also how it's being used and indeed its role in the Australian economy. So we were after some sort of degree of quantification of the direct and indirect contributions of seabed mapping data to the economy. And we're also keen to get an update on the social and environmental benefits that are related to those data. And also importantly, we're really hoping to get some new insights into opportunities to enhance the value of the seabed data. And so what I'll talk about today are very much related to those first 2 dot points in terms of national perspective and a stab at quantifying the direct and indirect contributions of seabed mapping data. Okay, so what am I talking about in terms of seabed mapping data? Well, we define it as data that describes the depth, shape, composition, and structure of the seabed and coastline. And in that graphic, you can see some of the types of data that are regularly collected in this instance by RV Investigator. Using its multi-beam systems and its sub-bottom profiling systems, it acquires high resolution data in terms of the depth, shape, and composition of the seabed. But although multi-beam bathymetry really is one of the foundation data sets for seabed mapping, it's not the only sort of data that's acquired. So there's also directly sampling the seabed in terms of sediments and biological material, but as well as images of the composition of the seabed and biological communities. And important, these different sorts of data can be integrated to provide really useful insights into the distribution of, for instance, sediment types, but also biological community types, and indeed key insights into some of the driving processes that are occurring on the seabed in terms of, for instance, bed form features as noted in that bottom graphic, but also in terms of, the influences on the distribution of biodiversity. So applications of the data, they're many and varied, given that it is a foundation data type, ranging from habitat mapping, it's needed for infrastructure, for marine hazard modeling and coastal hydrodynamic modeling, and also looking at stability of the seabed and hazards there posed to seabed infrastructure. But of course, there are those really important primary functions of the data in terms of charting our marine area and also developing ocean current circulation models. Okay, so in terms of the approach that Deloitte took, they used what they term a economic contribution analysis. So it's a type of an input-output modeling approach. And that analysis was informed by information on what I'm terming here the seabed sector or seabed mapping data sector, and also information and related economic data for the year 2018-19. So this included a survey of seabed mapping data producer and user organisations, and workshops with representatives of those organisations, as well as one-on-one consultations with representatives of some of the key organisations involved in data production and use. And of course, they drew on the published economic data, both from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, but also went through and looked at quite a few different organisations' annual reports to get information on, their expenditure and returns. So one of the first things that Deloitte did was to, I guess, characterise the seabed mapping industry, if you like, what they're terming here the supply chain. And you can see that it's divided between data producers and data users. So they're conceptualizing how data is acquired and who uses it and why they're using it. So it includes the data producer activities and the data producer organizations, as well as identifies the data user activities and the data user industries. Now, importantly, the data user industries are further considered to be those industries that are either unlocked by using seabed mapping data. So they're industries, for instance, that such as offshore infrastructure, where seabed mapping data is required to in the planning and construction phase of offshore infrastructure, but it's not required for the ongoing operation of that infrastructure. And then the other type of data user industry is where seabed mapping data is required for its operation. So in that instance, it's industries such as marine tourism and fishing, where you can't undertake the activity unless you have that data at hand. Okay, and just a simple graphic that shows how the value chains were characterized. In this instance, it's to do mostly with the data production value chain, which moves from survey planning and data collection, processing, management and distribution. and eventually gets to, if you like, the data user sector. And that's where the really big impact comes, as you'll see in a minute. So in terms of the economic contribution analysis, this graphic gives a bit of an overview of what that's all about. So it's both the direct value added directly derived from seabed mapping, which comprises wages and profits and direct employment. It also includes the indirect value added. So this is the upstream expenditure. So this is the, if you like, the support activities that are required for organizations directly in working in the area to be able to undertake their activities. So it's the demand that's created in other industries by an industry undertaking an activity that requires seabed mapping data. Okay, so first up, the seabed data production sector. So this sector is, this table shows the contribution of the seabed, of actually producing seabed mapping data. And it should be noted that this is quite a conservative estimate because Deloitte's found limitations in the data that were available. And they also made the point that it's relatively low in dollar terms compared to other sort of comparable industries, I guess, in that there is quite a bit of not-for-profit activity that goes into seabed mapping data. So several organizations are not driven by profit alone in terms of acquiring the data. But as you'll see in a minute, has a big impact downstream. So the numbers here are still worth noting that the value added from actually acquiring data in that year, just under 78 million, and there was 622 jobs associated with that. So then if we move to the value added in terms of the users of those data, you can see that the figures change from millions of dollars to billions of dollars. So this is in terms of the value added through activities that require seabed mapping data in their operation, and which is the 16 billion, and then industries where the value add relates to their activities being unlocked by that data, which is just under the 49 billion. Okay, and then if we look at employment related to those operational and unlocked industries, you can see that quite significant numbers there in terms of 93,000 jobs in relation to the operational use, and a bit under 83,000 jobs in terms of the unlocked industries. Okay, and that can also be broken down into subsectors. So in terms of operational use, the very big industries there are related to defence, tourism, water transport, and commercial fishing. So that's for the operational users, and then the industries that are unlocked, you can see it's very much dominated by the oil and gas extraction. So very big numbers there, almost 50 billion. And jobs related to the same sorts of operations. You can see that for the operational entities or activities that, again, it's tourism, defence and water transport. And in terms of the unlocked activities, once again, oil and gas with, very big numbers there in terms of jobs. Okay, so just to summarize some of the numbers that are in the report. And then the emphasis here is that, the seabed mapping data very much enables an extensive range of economic activities. So it's that enablement element that's so important. So for example, in using that base year of 2018-19, there was the data directly contributed to $9 billion of value add and employment of over 56,000 full-time equivalents. So this is a significant role it's playing in the economy. So it's actually bigger than the size of the air and space transport sector, which is quite a significant chunk of the economy. So it also creates those upstream demands, and that contributed a further $7 billion in indirect value add. And then additionally, there was this 37 billion of unlocked economic activities that required seabed mapping data in their establishment, as I mentioned before, in terms of things like offshore infrastructure development. Okay, so another aspect of the report that I'm not going into much here, but an important part of what we were hoping to get from the report was some insights into, okay, well, how can we get additional value out of seabed mapping data? And there's four main points here that point to how we can potentially do that. So first of all, I guess it's the obvious. It's to fill the important gaps. There's still areas that are very poorly mapped in our marine estate, and therefore we can create extra value by indeed increasing that overall coverage, and also targeting priority areas where more data is required. The second point points to the fact that there are a range of archives of seabed data that haven't been released publicly. So yeah, that's another one we'd really like to look at in more detail and action that at some stage. And indeed modernizing data management and the online access to the data. So making the data more readily discoverable and accessible, and ensuring that it's standards compliant. And the last point there is about making sure that the data is useful to some of these key or indeed emerging marine industries. So there we're referring to things like offshore renewable energy and marine related tourism activities. Okay, so just to finish up, the report, we're anticipating that'll be available online via the Deloitte's Access Economics website and indeed a bit later on from the GA website, hopefully early in October, and there will be some media, social media posts on that will come out, yeah, immediately prior to the release. But please feel free to contact me if you'd like an update on that or any additional information about the report. And that's it, Kim, thanks.
Thank you, Brendan, for this. It's much awaited report and some values. I think people would definitely be interested to use those. I think if I'm right to it, there hasn't been many done internationally about the value of seabed mapping itself. So, so I think it's going to be used more broadly too. Do we have any question here? You can use the chat again. Oh, I see Donna. Yeah, if you can turn your video if you want to, or just go ahead.
Oh, hi. That was really awesome, but I was just wondering if the report goes down to the level of the value of Indigenous data to Australian marine research.
Not really. It touches on that, and it looks a little bit about, I guess, the converse of it. You know, the value of seabed data in giving us insights into areas that were formerly occupied by Indigenous peoples. But yeah, hasn't really gone into that in any detail.
Thanks.
Let's ask question.
Yeah, Miguel.
Hi, Brendan. Very nice presentation. Thank you. Just the parameter of seabed mapping, like resolution, for example, does it find its way into some final figures, or is it just irrelevant?
Not sure I got the question. Can you just repeat that?
A resolution of your data set, like horizontal resolution of your data set, does it somehow affect your final estimates, or it's irrelevant?
Yeah, the report doesn't really go into the details of the things like the resolution of the data. But yeah, definitely the greater value. I guess there's a general rule that would be the greater the resolution, the greater the value of the data for a increased variety of users. But sometimes it's a spatial coverage at a lower resolution is very important as well. So not sure if that answers the question for you, but
I think that's a great question, being a seabed mapping lover, but and I think we should look at a graph, but we're also, sorry for adding, but I think we're also looking at limitation into the resolution we can output and the instrument that can collect that resolution. It's either you have it all or you have it none. So a little bit of that, but it'd be definitely a good question to follow on and investigate in the future. Martina.
Thanks. Brendan, I was curious whether the process gave you any insights as to whether the Australian seabed was more valuable or this process would scale equally across the entire global seabed, or whether there's some unique things about Australia that you felt was worth or you could share with us.
I guess you know, the unique things about Australia are, and Lyndon touched on that, is I think the you know, what was reinforced to me was the importance of the marine environment in terms of the industries it supports and the significance of those for our economy. You know, we're really dependent on that marine environment for our economic well-being. Yeah, so I think we really need to communicate that much better than it is at the moment. Yeah, the report sort of talks a little bit about that in terms of you know, the history of you know, why seabed mapping data, for instance, lags so far behind the mapping of our terrestrial environments. You know, part of it is very much you know, the technology challenge that's you know, relatively recently been addressed in an effective way, but also we just haven't had a good how would you put it, consciousness or awareness of the seabed environment, you know, more broadly in society. So I think now's the time that we need to improve that. And you know, a great way of getting attention is through showing, you know, some of this economic data.
Thank you, Martina and Brendan. Anyone last question? I think that's that's definitely a good question, Martina. And then with some of the initiative, the more global initiative like the seabed 2030 project with JEPCO and Nippon would certainly stimulate other analysis of the kind, and it'd be really interesting to bring them together and then see how those compare. As I think it's and it shows does Australia, like, you know, has more value than a European country, for instance? I don't know, it'd be an interesting question, so keep that in mind. Thanks.
Yeah, Kim, on that same vein, you know, I guess there is a big contrast between us and, you know, for instance, some of the European Union countries and the United States, where they you know, well recognise what we're talking about here, and they've instigated, you know, well-resourced national programs to actually completely cover their marine estate with high quality data. So I guess there's that's one point of contrast that you know, we haven't really addressed as yet, but hopefully we can.
I think many of us wonder at which point do we tip the balance so that it happens if we get investment and then we get these mandate to do certain things, whatever science it is, that other countries have gone forward already. So I think we're all searching for that tipping point. Hopefully we find it. Thanks. So right on time, I'll move on to Tara, who's going to talk to us about the impact of the MNF.
Thanks very much, Kim. And I'll just share my screen and set myself up into presenter mode.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Just checking you've got the right view. Lovely. So, hello all, I'm the Acting Director for the Marine National Facility, and I'm going to talk to you about some impact assessment which was done for the Marine National Facility in 2020. So for those who don't know, the Marine National Facility is owned and operated by CSIRO on behalf of the nation, and it comprises a blue water research capability, a suite of scientific instrumentation, a collection of almost 40 years of marine data now, and the expertise required to manage blue water research.
Your Jabra has come up.
Oh, so it has. Apologies. Thank you. The phone rang just as I started speaking. Appreciated. I'm looking at the other screen. And the expertise required to manage blue water research and support research vessel users. But what we really needed to understand after all of that period of time of facilitating science at sea was what the actual impact of the work that we provide is. So in 2020, we commissioned RTI to undertake some effort into the impact of the research, training and economic value for the Marine National Facility and the RV Investigator. So it was very much a three-part impact which we were trying to achieve. RTI International are an independent non-profit research institute composed of economists, researchers, analysts and value chain specialists. And to conduct this work, they did a publication analysis, interviews with stakeholders, surveys of researchers and students, and a cost-benefit economic analysis. And to bring the headline to the top, that identified value included seabed mapping, fisheries risk reduction, improved reef health and ecosystem services, marine species protection, more accurate weather and climate forecasting, and shipwreck discovery, and very importantly, a research training facility for SEN students. So what I'd like to do is step you through the three different types of impact which were looked at, the first of which is research impact. So in terms of knowledge and scientific publications for Investigator, which was delivered in 2014, so far they identified 150 peer-reviewed papers with getting on for 1,300 citations, about half of which were published in top-tier journals. And the graphic which you're looking at here gives a feel for the types of areas which have been, types of science which have been described in those papers. So not surprisingly, oceanography and fisheries are pretty big, but quite interestingly, marine freshwater biology and limnology are right up there at the top as well. So limnology is the study of rivers, and I am aware that there have been some surveys which have shown freshwater plumes going out into the sea. So that might explain that for those who might be curious. The numbers you're seeing here are the cumulative counts of publications in all journals categories where a journal can be assigned to up to 4 categories, such as an article in a refereed journal or a non-refereed journal, and so on. The data collection capabilities, which were described as the key impacts provided, were particularly in the areas of atmospheric sampling, geophysical survey and mapping, biological sampling, and seawater analysis capability. And these were identified as comparatively unique in the Australian context. In terms of resource management and practice and public policy solutions and teaching, the real impact which the Marine National Facility was shown to provide was in providing new knowledge and evidence-based data, improving policies at federal, state and international levels, management plans for marine parks, development of standard operating procedures, particularly in reporting and recording shipwrecks, and new teaching and research methods, not only through the Educator on Board program, which Marine National Facility has run, but also through going through into universities and the teaching which principal investigators undertake there as well. Asked whether the research would be possible without the RV investigator, about 92% of the people on board suggested that in Australia, the research that they were doing would not have been possible. When asked what other paths there might be, about 45% of them suggested they might try to partner with an international research vessel. 35% said they would try to use a different domestic vessel like Aurora Australis. However, the high cost of ship time was a significant barrier for entry to most. For those who aren't aware, we provide sea time free of charge. And some explained that investigator was actually the only option for their science because of the equipment and capabilities provided on the vessel. The survey spoke to 107 students, of whom 86% felt it wouldn't have been possible to gain the same quality research experience and training without the RV investigator. And the areas that they thought provided the most impact were around technical expertise, collaboration, applied research, professional networks, fundamental science knowledge, and positive career outcomes. The MNF provides capability development to students through 3 formal mechanisms: involvement in research projects, CAPSTAN, which is the Collaborative Australian Postgraduate Sea Training Alliance Network, and our Indigenous Time at Sea scholarships. These training programs are building the next generation of marine industry leaders that come from different education levels and disciplines. And as you can see, it's having quite significant impact on the careers of students who are coming on board. Digging down into that career impact, about 35% of the students either agreed or strongly agreed that their experience on the investigator had helped them obtain their current position. So we're certainly playing our part in providing capability for the researchers of tomorrow. We also did take a look at Indigenous knowledge systems, and certainly a significant number of respondents were intending to incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems in their future work. The experience on Investigator, particularly where we had an Indigenous student on board, was changing respondents' knowledge of Indigenous systems' role in science. And so far, about 13% of the projects on board do incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems. However, it's really important to note that there's quite a change there between principal investigators' points of view compared to those of students. And we can see that potentially students have a bit more intrinsic knowledge, but we are seeing strong evidence of increase of Indigenous knowledge in projects going forward. Looking at the economic impact which was determined, there were a number of key benefits that were identified through this study, taken down into primarily seabed mapping, ecosystem health, weather forecasting, and maritime heritage. And I'm not going to read the words on this slide, and I will apologise that it's quite a wordy slide. But the key highlight here is that the public and private sectors are leveraging the high quality bathymetric, biological, atmospheric and geophysical data which the investigator is acquiring to deepen and widen their understanding around marine ecosystems, climate, weather changes in the Southern Ocean, fisheries, and to help address other key challenges for the nation. The underway data which we acquire plays a critical role in evidence-based decision-making, feeds into devising resource and risk management strategies and offshore activities. And conservatively, the study identified a benefit to cost ratio of somewhere in the order of 4.7 to 1. So for every dollar that is spent operating the facility, the monetized value of these economic impacts were assumed to be 4.7 times that. Through the period from 2010 through to 2030. So that's a fairly brief flick through the survey which was done through RTI. We'll be taking that information and digging further down into that as we look at the forward strategy for the Marine National Facility and the types of science we're looking to support, but also to come up with further ways to inform the impact which we're providing. And I'll leave that there for questions.
Thank you, Tara. Ask you to just unshare or stop sharing your screen.
I can do that. As I'm doing that, I will note that that 4.7 to 1 was just for the underway systems, because it was considered too early to assess individual voyage economic contributions with the information we had at hand.
Oh, so you're thinking that you could go to the level of individual voyages and looking at their contribution?
Not with this survey, that would require future surveys.
Yeah, I think that's definitely ambitious to look at all these details. So that's great. Thanks. Anyone? I see someone might have tried to turn on their screen, but not seeing. Any question? So, oh yeah, Amy. Amy, no. Now, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. I think it's now.
You're on mute if you're speaking, Amy.
All right. So I've got a few questions, probably for Lyndon and Brendan as well, and Tara. So if you don't mind turning on your cameras, if you are still here. I was wondering here, through probably for Lyndon here, you mentioned about the tourism, the international tourism, probably 2 billion. And it's much, much lower than the international tourism. So, but you expect that that's underestimated. Do you know, though, that what is the proportion that we see the marine tourism compare in international compared to the overarching international tourism in Australia? Like you would assume a lot of international come for marine tourism that would be associated with it. Do we know that proportion?
Yeah, that's good. It's a good question, Kim. I don't know what proportion is marine versus total international tourism. It's a good question. A lot of people, you know, a lot of international tourism fly into Sydney and Melbourne, and a lot of activities happen around there. I don't know. I can have a look and see what that might be actually.
So I guess we can estimate that the 70 billion or so, if the international is underestimated, would go up a fair bit in your hope in a way, if that's the case. Through your experience, I think that might be also going to Lyndon, but anyone can answer. I wonder if through the science community, we see more and more of different science group and trying to look for impact, you know, measure impact, measure the economic and so and so. You would have seen we get better longer we do it, and then we look around. I know AIMS, IMOS, CSRO are doing that. would you have a reference, like who you'd think, I'm not feeling bad for the other, but who is the exemplar case that someone who wants to come and try to look at this and follow, who do you think we should use as a reference to say, you know, it's working and they've got experience and then we can follow that path?
I think the CSIRO guys have been doing this for a while, so I think there's some really good work has been done there. It's much of their analyses have not been in the marine space, though. They've done some analyses in the marine area, but the people that they use, the people we use, and some of them are very good. So I think that there's some really powerful learnings can be gotten from the CSIRO group that does this work, because they've been doing this for a lot longer than the marine science community in general.
That's great, thanks. Anyone can jump in if you have a question that you want to ask, just raise your hand. I'm going to go through my couple more I have. And unless someone else Tara?
Kim,
yeah?
I'd actually like to jump in and follow up on
Yes.
Lyndon's comment, which is I see more and more of a demand of demonstrating this impact. As it gets harder to obtain research funding, it's becoming more important for the science community to actually be able to identify the value that they return for their investment. And that can be really quite challenging and intangible. So having these types of studies, particularly where you're trying to talk about intangible cultural things, it's one thing to do an economic impact study, but to try to actually assess the impact on, for example, someone's career, it does take quite a bit of effort to look at the many different facets that describe what that impact is.
Yeah, so I wonder on this note, you know, we think about the return on investment of marine science and the industry, and I wonder if I don't think we totally understand, you know, how much is being spent on marine science and what the return is. And I wonder on all this if the NMSC, the National Marine Science Committee, is there a role in using or coordinating the group to help with some of these most important analysis? Like we know the marine industry, like Lyndon, the AIMS Index, but understanding that marine science contribution, I wonder if there's a role there. So it's just an open question. Lyndon, yes? Yeah,
I'd suggest yes, Kim. I think everyone's learning in this whole space. I agree with Tara. There's a lot of value in being able to have robust analyses and robust numbers to get across to stakeholders about what the value of science is. And by robust, I mean numbers that they believe. We've got to be careful we don't overvalue the impact sort of thing. So it's got to be believable. And I do think there is a role to play to try and increase consistency across the community about how we talk about these sorts of things. And because if we're consistent, then as what the NMSC is trying to do is we'll all be singing from the same page, and so it'll be a single voice from the whole community rather than a cacophony of different voices.
Yeah, I think it sounds like for consistency, you need a framework, you need something NMSC could look at the best practice and try to offer that support across. I'll say Tony, I can see Tony, but I want to keep this in our back pocket.
Oh my God, what else?
So for you three, oh, sorry, Ian, if you can turn on your video too.
Oh, that's a good question. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
I don't see a video option at the moment so I'm sorry, you'll have to just listen to my voice.
That's fine.
I had a question for any of the speakers, actually. Just wondering if any of them or any of the reports look into the future at all, given that it seems that oil and gas plays a significant economic part of the future. What does it look like? You know, presumably we'll transition into a bit more renewable. What's the future like for the national facility or seabed mapping if a significant proportion of the money from oil and gas isn't there?
I think that's a big conversation that the community again needs to start having a chew on. I think we need to get better at understanding other sectors that we don't currently know, but getting a better understanding of emerging sectors, because like I was saying before, we need them to mature, because there is a substantial part of the industry and the market, the blue market economy, I suppose, which will dissipate or get less on over the years. So we do need to start thinking about this sort of thing, because those transitions take many years to bring about, and we would like those transitions to be informed rather than by evidence rather than by feel.
All right, Brendan.
Yeah, I could maybe just add another comment. Yeah, that was a great question, and I would say, yeah, it's both very scary looking into the future with you know, a decline in demand for fossil fuels, and indeed a decrease in the availability of them eventually. But there's also some glimmers of hope, I guess you'd call it, or maybe a bit more than that, when you look at things like tourism, you know, marine and coastal-based tourism. I think there's some great examples in Australia of how that's being conducted in a, you know, in a sustainable way, and how it can be has the potential to expand, and you know, it's already a major component of our economy, and in particular, you know, it generates a hell of a lot of jobs. So yeah, it's really important, especially in regional areas and regional centres. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks,
Kim,
Tara.
I think
Yeah.
coming off Brendan's comment, there are some exemplars of science which are actually starting to consider life after fossil fuels and how we maximise the economic impact coming from that. And one example of that would, for example, in Tasmania, be the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre, which is trying to identify ways to sustainably operate fish farming offshore. So I think we are starting to see that change in the way people think about science, from the traditional disciplinary driven to trying to answer some of the challenge driven science going forward.
Yep.
I think we need to give confidence that there is a solution, and it's a good one too.
Yep.
I will go to Martina.
Super. It's terrific to hear the discussion, and so I guess I wanted to echo Lyndon's comment that I think NMSC could play a role in potentially aligning some principles around how one would do these studies, so that we could make comparisons across space and time to look at effective interventions, for example, where we could demonstrate increased sustainability. And so I guess I would be supportive of a process to allow a proponent for an idea for a case study to come forward to NMSC and potentially use the brains trust in the committee to come up with a set of principles around how we could generate an Australian benchmark or something like that. Because then, as is so effective when we speak with one voice in this community, that we can basically set the standard around how to do this well and demonstrate value. So I guess speaking from a kind of a southeast perspective, I would welcome that. I think it's absolutely the way that we'll make the case for successful investment.
You're totally right. I think speaking as a voice, and as you know, Martina, with the NMSC, we work with working groups. So I think to try to get this up the ground, we'll put this as one of the point to discuss maybe, and highlight to the committee again at the next meeting maybe, and try to find a solution, because it's so, like everyone say, it's so important, and we do have leaders in the field right now that we could try to pull together to move forward. So not naming anyone, but we could go there. I would ask on the follow-on, well, anyone wants to comment on further on Martina? Okay, so just to follow on, I've got 2 more questions. So we're going to wrap up soon unless you keep coming with a question. So what would you, you 3 have undertaken those analysis and many more, and Lyndon's done few by now, and you understand what it takes. But for anyone who wants to undertake one, I know now we're talking about a best practice or principles, but what would you recommend, and what would you say the lesson learned that you could share beforehand? Because I know from our end, Brendan, it's been a bit of a challenge, and we talked about the underlying data. So how do we rally the right community to give the right data? But so can you expand? Do you have a lesson to tell, or a warning or something about it that you could share right now?
You want me to elaborate on our experience, Kim?
Yeah, why not start?
Yeah, look, I guess you know, we've got some really great information out of the analysis that's been done by Deloitte. Yeah, absolutely, it was good and value for money. I guess what we've learnt from it is we probably should have done more homework ourselves in terms of you know, what was possible in terms of like standard accepted economic modeling approaches that are recognized by the organizations and institutions that you're trying to impress. So in our case, it's you know, organizations like the Treasury and you know, the upper levels of government. So, you know, you want to have a pretty conservative and standardized approach. And what some of the information we were that we were after, you can't get from that approach. So yeah, that was one thing I'd say. But maybe you've actually just got to do one of these, get one of these reports done to yeah, learn some of that.
Again, I think the best practice will help for this. Lyndon or Tara, something a lesson to share?
So I'll probably make 3 quick points. One is when you go off on these journeys, be prepared to enter the twilight zone. It's you know, it's interesting dealing with economists. They talk about being the dark art, and it really isn't art. And as a scientist, it's really hard. It's really difficult. It's a struggle to deal with the uncertainty. That seems to be the economist's bread and butter. And they feel like, oh, what's a few billion here or there? That's, you know, water under the bridge kind of stuff. The other one is prepare to be schizophrenic. In my experience, you need to be able to wear 2 hats. You need to wear a white hat when you look at the science and try and work out, in the best possible world, this story is true. But then you need to then put your black hat on and say, in the worst possible world, I don't believe it, kind of thing. So you need to be able to be schizophrenic, going from be very optimistic to gather all the possible stories, and then be somewhat pessimistic to bring some reality to it. And lastly, attribution is a nightmare. Being able to actually draw the connections between the end result and the science is really, really difficult. One of the best method I came across is a really simple, the 5 whys approach, where you just simply ask why, and eventually you come back to the point where you can go, yep, that's where our science kicked off a process that then had a domino effect. But the attribution is really, really hard.
Thank you,
And
very insightful. Tara, yes.
I think jumping in there, I'm slightly on the back foot with this question, because those who know me know I wasn't involved in the commissioning of the impact study which we did. But I think that based on the conversations I've had with the people who were directly involved, the one piece of advice I would give is be really, really clear on what you're trying to achieve from it. It's really easy to say we're going to measure impact, but you need to have a really good understanding of what kind of impact and how you would like to understand that.
Thank you, Tara. I think Tony might have more insights there. Hands up.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that because I was conscious that Tara inherited, and Donna's on here, who was very much one of the architects. But just a couple of other comments in addition to the ones I've heard is that I think actually, in some respects, you've just got to also give it a go, because I think you don't know what you don't know when you first do it. And what it highlighted for us is maybe some of the data that we weren't collecting that would have provided a more deep understanding. But it's sort of and I think it takes longer, which I think, you know, Brendan, it takes longer than you think. I think it takes a much greater, even though you get a consultant to do it, it demands a lot of your time, a lot of data that you need to gather. But I think you give it a go because it gets better, because then you know what you don't know. You know what they asked that you didn't collect, you collect it and you improve. And I think that that's one of the real benefit of the AIMS. You know, the fact that you've been doing it in England for so long is I think it probably gets better as you actually refine it. And as you say, as you start to learn how to speak to the economists that are, you know, clearly wizards from Harry Potter. So there's a couple of comments.
Very good comments, Tony. Very good. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks. I think everyone is on the way. Probably want to get an extra half hour. I guess I have one. Well, I do have another question that I'd like to ask. It's for Brendan. You know, in the economic study, we did have a defense as the top sector for seabed mapping. I think that's interesting when we look at it from being the top driver and saying we need data to help with defense and security. Is that a risk to open data? You know, to have this sector as the prominent one, if that's what we are using, and for obviously the marine science community wants to have access for more than that. But if it's our driver, is there a relationship or maybe not?
Yeah, I guess a way of looking at that is that you know, defence have their requirements, and you know, they'll use whatever data is available to meet that. But that can, you know, data that's collected, you know, in a sort of not-for-profit context is generally publicly available. So yeah, I think, you know, defence acquire a lot of their own data. I think that's what you're alluding to, and that's not necessarily immediately available, but yeah, it goes the other way as well, that they will take up and use and we'll all gain, you know, some benefit from you know, the publicly available data being used in that defence context as well.
Thanks, Brendan. So if no one has any other question, or this will be your last chance, I'll ask one last one here. So we've seen big numbers in terms of return or the value. So can we say that these have been effective in supporting various investments that we've, you know, how much have we used those and been successful because of those numbers? Is there a correlation?
Oh, that's a good and tough question. And I wouldn't want to go, yeah, I don't know. It's a good, tough question.
But it makes us feel better to know that we're important too. So I think that's,
yeah,
a good
right.
supportive.
That's why I think we need to be better with the attribution, that we can actually hand on heart say that growth or whatever, or security of economy and other things can be directly attributable to marine science. So I think that is something that we do need to drill into.
Tony?
I just wanted to say, I mean, I agree with Lyndon, and I think it's one tool in the toolbox, and so I think it's hard to say that it's a direct contributor to success. But I think when you think about who makes decisions around investment, you know, you tell a science story, you tell an impact story, you tell an education story, you tell an economic story, and so I think, you know, without it, I think that, you know, I think your argument is weaker, but I think without all the other emotional aspects of, which is really about the science and the impact and the environment and the industry and the jobs and all the rest of it, you know, but I think it just shores up and strengthens the position. So that's my view. And I do think that, you know, the AIMS index, and I think earlier there was a question from Ian around the projection, and the projection around the value of the blue economy to Australia has been a statement you see a lot. And I certainly think that some of the work that the early NMSC has done to speak with one voice, to provide a number that everyone references, has been to the benefit of the investment in marine science across Australia. So yes, I think it is worth doing. I think it's worth, and I think Martina's gone now, those questions about who do we get to do, you know, how do we do them? And I think where we can do cross-organisational, you know, sectoral representations, as you've done with the seabed mapping one through GA, I think that they're the really beneficial ones as well. I mean, because then, you know, you do see a collegiate position being put forward that multiple parties can adopt and promulgate, and I think that that's what the government likes to see. So yeah, sorry, that's my 2 cents. I feel buoyed because Lyndon's nodding, which means that it's not complete rubbish. Thanks, Lyndon.
Spot on.
Thank you, Tony. Well, last words to the speakers, if you anything.
My closing comment would be, it's, you know, from a sort of selfish perspective, this will really help justify our existence in our host organisation. Having these sorts of numbers help.
Yeah, thanks. Tara?
Well, I was actually going to make a quite similar comment. I think the real benefit of doing this is being able to demonstrate as opposed to just feel the impact. We hear anecdotes around the effort that the Marine National Facility provides, for example, to Australian science and international science, but being able to quantify that really has power.
Thanks, Tara. And Lyndon?
Oh, I think I've probably said enough, Kim. So, yeah.
Wise. I'm sure we'll be knocking on your door. You'll have few knocks coming forward. So this is great. Thanks again to all the speakers, for everyone to coming online. Tony, I'm not sure if you wanted to have another last word here. We'll see this event has been recorded, so we will put it onto our website. I think it would be great under our page, The Blue Economy. So you'll be in there for the future, and if anyone missed that. But yes, Tony, if you want to.
My final comment would be, as I put in the chat, I just wanted to thank Lyndon, Brendan and Tara for presenting. I thought that they were 3 excellent presentations. I think interestingly quite different, you know, which was really useful to see the different approaches that had you know, that come together to support it. And also to you, Kim, because I know you've done a lot of background work, so, you know, getting people lined up and coordinating and putting the questions together. So I think it's been a really interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And hopefully it's as sunny as it is here in Canberra, and go have a bit of fresh air. Bye.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.